everybody. Welcome to the BAT podcast. This is Randy Nonnenberg here with Howard Swig. Howard, how you doing?
I'm good, man. How are you?
Great. Good to be back again. We had a fun one last week with the Sludjo interview. That got a bunch of people riled up and excited. And today we're going to talk about race cars. We're excited to talk about race cars.
Yeah, no, we got some awesome feedback on our episode on project cars. So we were kicking around some ideas in that vein. And race cars and vintage racing are something near and dear to me and Randy. It's always been an interest of ours, driving, spectating, participating, and attending events. So this is a topic that could probably stretch over many, many podcasts, but we thought it was definitely worthwhile to chat about today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think you have to be, a hardcore FIA licensed racer or pro racer or something like that to have an interest in this part of our site and the car universe. Like, I'm a pretty terrible driver. I've done a couple of driving schools, did Skip Barber, did Derek Daly back in the day in Vegas in Formula cars. All the instructors said I was way too risk averse and super slow in the corners, but I loved it. It was super fun, and I still like getting out to the track. I love spectating. I love the scene in the pits. I love crewing for folks, right? Like schlepping tires around or tools around. I'm much better at that than I am at driving. But Howard, you have kind of the opposite story. You've spent a bunch of time on track in all different sorts of cars. Is that right?
That's true. Derek Daly, just to go back, I don't even know, you lost me on that. I'm too old for that, or too young for that, I should say, even though you're not that much older than me. I knew I could do Jim Russell, obviously Bondurant and Skip, but I've been fortunate to get a bunch of seat time in old cars. I was fortunate to have a family that allowed me access to that. My first vintage race was in a 1931 Chrysler. Which I think is a good place to start because you learn about primitive equipment and developing sympathy for using that equipment, and makes it easier to move up the ladder, so to speak. I started doing that in my early 20s. It was funny to go to, that's like Group 1A is the pre-war cars. So I was 24, showed up at the Group 1A drivers meeting, and it's mostly dudes in their 70s and 80s, and I show up, and that's I was joshing around with those guys because they're like, yeah, you're bringing down the average age of our group by a meaningful amount here.
Half a century, right?
Totally. Yeah. And I'm like, you guys are like as old as the cars we're driving, so I don't know if that's awesome or terrifying. Randy and I are down at Monterey is kind of the Indy 500 of vintage racing in the U.S., so we're stoked that we just have a short ride over there to check that out every year. We've hosted some cool BAT events there. I've been lucky enough to drive at that event 7 or 8 times now. The whole vintage racing scene and underworld is something that we think is super interesting. So we're gonna knock out a few topics on this, and I'm sure people listening would have their own questions and things to share.
Yeah, and it's really, the diversity in those sort of paddocks is really crazy. You talk about a 31 Chrysler. I mean, you start there, and then you get into, 4-cylinder cars, momentum cars, or sub 1 liter sports cars, right? And then you get into, the beasts that are out there that these just wild men are driving, whether they're Can-Am cars or Formula 5000 cars or stuff that really wants to kill you on track. And you go to these events, and most of them have a good mix of that. And then there's some super, I think, easy access points like Formula Ford or, Formula V, if you really want to go that route, or some of these sports cars. You spent some time in a Datsun 510 on track, which I've always said is just a cool model to get you out there and doing laps. Your one that you drove is pretty special with history and that sort of stuff. But going and finding either a project race car or a cool 60s, 70s, 80s 4-cylinder race car doesn't have to totally break the bank, and you can end up putting it on track. And so we want to talk about vintage racing. There's also track days. A lot of cars bought on BAT are used at track days. There's club racing. There's obviously pro type racing that happens, and runoffs and SCCA and different sorts of stuff. There's so many ways you could talk about this. But yeah, we like steering towards the kind of cars we see transacting on BAT, but also events, right? Like what events are near you, what tracks are near you, what's going on there. A fun thing that I always like doing is just go into the website of a lot of tracks that you like or that are close to you and looking at the calendar, right? There'll be a moto race, then there'll be an open track day on some weekday, and then there'll be maybe a legit IndyCar thing once a year, and then there'll be a couple vintage things sort of sprinkled in. And figuring out what's going on around the track in your region is pretty cool, and a cool way to start seeing some cars you may not have seen before.
Yeah, and what you said is so true. Those more approachable groups and classes tend to have the biggest fields and be the most competitive. Like the opposite, you mentioned F5000. Like they did an F5000 race at Monterey a few years ago, and to put that together, like you got to get all the cars from New Zealand and ship them to wherever you're going to host the race. Like that's the opposite of a Formula Ford or B sedan group. So I've in the last few years gotten in with the B sedan crowd in California. I've rented a Datsun 510 to drive, and that's like so awesome, like so competitive. That's like Datsun 510s and Alpha GTVs and BMW 2002s, and that's like the closest you get to like a vintage equivalent of like a Spec Miata race. Driving ability is pretty high, super competitive. The cars are like, I think most vintage cars have gotten faster with age, right? All these cars today are way quicker and more well prepared than they were whenever they raced in period. This little 510 I drive is like 190 horsepower at the wheels with big 50 Weber carburetors. And man, I remember I showed up for the driving it for the first time, and I've driven some race cars, anything too serious. Not that a 510 is so serious, but it has like a full racing clutch in it, and I hadn't had that much experience with that, like total like on-off light switch. So I show up, never drove the car before. Thursday, drive it over to Tech. I'm there with the pit crew, meeting everyone. They say, "Okay, Howard, why don't you hop in the 80 car, drive it over to the pit lane?" So I get in it and can't even get the thing out of the pits. Just trying to work this clutch, and everyone's waiting on me, so I'm like, oh god, I'm in this is like the main event in the feature race, and I can't even get this thing 5 feet in front of me, so I ended up getting it figured out. But
I love it. Yeah, and all of them are different, right? You go from car to car if you're racing different sorts of vehicles or different classes, and yeah, every clutch is different, every set of handling is different, every weak point is different on all the different cars, and that's something to watch drivers navigate in really cool ways. A really versatile driver can jump in a bunch of different cars and drive them, and there's a ton of experience in those paddocks, right? You're talking about being a first timer on that sort of deal. For better or worse, you may line up on the grid next to a guy who's been racing his 510 for 38 years and has done knows every bolt on the car and every aspect of the car.
You're next to John Norman, who actually drove his GTV in 1972 series, like next to John Morton. So yes, they're all out there.
Yeah, so those races are super fun to watch, and people are pretty willing to go after it a little bit. But I think it's interesting. You're talking about just start with B sedan. Man, there's so many layers to this. I'm realizing while we're talking about it. You can be running a super premier event like Monterey, and then there's a whole calendar of like Vera events, VARA, right? And then there's events in different regions and HSR, and then there's all these things that can kind of seem a little bit unwieldy to figure out what's going on, who's doing what cars are legal. I talk to West Coast racer guys, and they talk about like the East Coast rules and the West Coast rules, different styles of driving, and that's before you even start to peel it back and talk about like what's going on, call it overseas, right? Guys that are vintage racing over there bringing a car over here. So anyway, there's a ton to this, but what's good, maybe not true at Monterey, but what's good almost every place is it seems like people are excited to get new entrants, to get young entrants, to get different cars. If you just purchased a car, you can do some rounds of whether it's at a school or sort of a track organization that you can go and get some laps under your belt, and then start to sort of steer towards these cooler events that you've maybe been a spectator at and could actually go drive in.
Yeah, that's so true. Club level racing programs in every region has I don't know if it's exploded, but it's definitely picked up in the last 5 or 10 years. And yeah, I mean, there are cheaper hobbies than vintage racing, but it is something that's gotten, I think, relatively more affordable and accessible. And yeah, some of these local club groups, like you can go out and, you know, drive a, you know, late 90s Formula Mazda or, you know, all these more kind of accessible race cars, that there's enough of them that have survived and that people are actually buying and preparing to put a race group together. And yeah, the younger generation is a big part of it, right? Like the Group 1A drivers meeting in 2012 in Monterey, like that's not the future of racing, and if that is, then it's in trouble. But the good news is there is a lot of interest, and you see that in the groups and types of cars, right? Monterey or any of these big events 30 years ago, like most of a big portion of the grids were pre-war to 1960s cars, and now a lot of that has diminished. And they still got the great, right, like big bore 60s group with Vets and Mustangs. But so many more groups now are devoted to later cars from the 70s to the 2000s. And those are frankly cars that are more exciting to watch as a spectator. They're much safer to drive. So it's kind of, you know, I'm kind of sad that some of the older stuff, you know, gets phased out to a degree, but you know, I understand it, and it's part of the, you know, it's part of the cycle of life of this stuff.
Yeah, I think it's super cool, but highly unusual that you had a seat in a, you know, 30s era American race car, right? I mean, I don't think a lot of people have that experience, but a lot of people are sort of resurrecting those cars and keeping them on track. I think it's kind of unfortunate. Maybe in the UK or someplace else, there's a little bit more interest in that really early stuff, but I think the stuff that, you know, really resonates with so many people at many of these events is, 50s, 60s, 70s, getting into the 80s. In the recent years, even at some of the bigger events, started to see like 90s and 2000s, like touring cars or Trans Am, Mustangs or weird like Cougars or Oldsmobiles, right? These cars that like Tommy Kendall and these guys were racing. And I was watching on ABC Sports when I was a kid, right? Those cars, Valvoline sponsor and all this sort of stuff are out there. And those are now vintage. And those people are, I don't know who's building those or maintaining those or bringing those out. But I think they kind of put a concerted effort together, because you don't want to have like one of those against some other group and it's this sort of mishmash. The cool part is when you can actually get, call it 10 of those cars together, and it really is reminiscent of an old grid, and that magic that we used to see on racetracks and on TV back then. So I've seen an effort to do that. A couple guys are bringing over, you know, E30 BMW touring cars and Mercedes touring cars. Those are starting to like trickle in to the U.S. and there's guys in the Pacific Northwest running those, but they're still kind of cars without a home. Like if you get two of those on the same track, it's a miracle. But what everybody wants is the YouTube videos of DTM where there's like 45 of those on a track, and that's really, really hard to get in the U.S. There's some activity in Germany like that. But anyway, the newer stuff is equally fun to watch, I would say. It's kind of this burgeoning sort of part of vintage racing that we're starting to see.
Totally, yeah. Huge level of interest in the last few years in, like what you were saying, 80s and 90s era IMSA cars. I think IMSA is actually the featured marque at Monterey this upcoming year. Super cool to see a grid of those. The Masters series, they're kind of Halo is their F1 deal, but they do so much other stuff. Whereas something like an old 911 Cup car or a 355 Challenge car was just a paperweight. Now there's actually a series that you can go out and race those around the country and around the world. So as all this stuff evolves, stuff that, the old thing, there's nothing older than last year's race car, but as the hobby evolves, now there's stuff popping up and you can actually use them.
Yeah. So that's super cool to see. And I think that, so there are many cars on BAT that may qualify for some of those events. We've certainly sold cars that would qualify for absolute top tier events. But there's also cars that are sort of track prepped, like a modern Boxster or a modern S2000, or, guys are still tearing interiors out of these cars and slapping numbers on the side or just trying to go do time attack and work on their skills and set some sort of personal bests at a few different tracks, and do it more as a hobby. And we see a lot of those cars on BAT, right? And obviously some models cater to that more than others. But it's cool to see people still getting after that. And you have any experience with that, or you seen any of those cars and see that they have sort of a future as a track car?
Yeah, I would say more generally from my seat, like race cars are among the hardest types of cars to sell because, by definition, it's a narrow market for them. Certainly some of the dual purpose stuff, like people who got their S2000 or their 944 or their 968 or whatever it is, and they've modified it in such a way that they can go take it, to a HPD event on the weekend, but drive it during the week or whatever they're going to do. But yeah, vetting submissions for race cars is super interesting, and obviously this is a whole topic in and of itself. But yeah, they can be hard to sell. Some guys, like, I always think the funny thing is like, oh, I can sell it with you guys at this reserve or not, or I'll just go stick it on, racingjunk.com. And, I'm sure I don't know much about racing junk, but it seems like it's, kind of like a graveyard for race cars. Like, it's difficult. It's like, oh, I got my 77, Chrysler Cordoba F production car. I don't know, waiting around for the right guy for it. That's an extreme example, but we've sold some really awesome Can-Am cars. Like, I love Can-Am cars, but like, let's be honest, the amount of people that want to strap themselves into a McLaren M8F, like, that's a pretty small segment of the population. But we've had some M8Cs, M8Fs, and you stick it on BAT, and for some of that stuff, you need as wide an audience as possible. But no, I love. We've sold some really neat cars. I mean, favorites. We had a Porsche 962 a few years ago. I think a Chapman Tub car that was super awesome. We've most recently had probably the most significant race car we ever sold was that C7R Pratt & Miller Corvette factory race car that won its class at, I think, Le Mans and Daytona. Randy, you were fired up about that.
Yeah, a lot of people reached out to me about that one. Just a real landmark sale, and you don't see those cars. You don't see those cars offered. You see a lot of vintage race cars, right? Like, I mean, if you're watching, you can find even a 962 for sale, or you can find a Schumacher era Ferrari F1 car for sale. But those yellow factory supported Corvette race cars that were just really iconic and dominant in a bunch of different eras, right? I mean, I think they were running those yellow factory cars C4, 5, 6, 7. I mean, it was like a dynasty of sorts. To catch one of those for sale is super unusual, and those cars were so highly developed. And I'm biased towards front engine Corvettes. I like the front engine ones better than the new ones that have just come out. That's my personal thing. So to see that one, that was sort of the final evolution of that, and that was like a winning car and that sort of stuff. So to see that sell and to go gangbusters, so you have to wonder, right? So who's buying that car? I don't even know the individual, but I'm like, what profile of person is buying an 800K IMSA champion sort of super high horsepower car? That's not a car that you and your two cousins go take to the racetrack and go try to race it, right? I mean, I don't even know the systems on board there, but I mean, is that thing getting like full brake replacement like halfway through races and stuff? I mean, the expense to run that and the expertise required, it's not like some sort of joke like showroom stock sort of car, right? I mean, that thing is super serious. You got to show up with 15 people to race that car, and who's doing that?
It's probably not as intensive as racing Schumacher's 2000 F1 car, which probably requires a team of 45 people to run it. But yeah, no, that I wonder, man. I actually just pulled it up. I'm trying to go through the listing in real time to answer the questions you're asking. But yeah, I mean, that thing, there was 3 or 4 guys bidding on it. I feel like, if that's the level, if that's the end of the pool that you're swimming in, it's great. There's this whole cottage industry of preparing and supporting race cars, and I think that's very healthy, broadly speaking.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're spoiled around here, right? We know that Canepa is up the hill from here, and Virtuoso Performance is close to here. These are the types of guys that are like turnkey at the vintage race weekends. Like, you show up and drive your highly exotic car, and they'll like make it happen for writing some big check. And I guess that's how that works, but it's a little bit foreign to me how that works. But I think that, I'm always just fascinated. Like, where's that car going to go? I mean, honestly, it's there's also the other end of the spectrum where that car could be like museum grade, right? I mean, that could go to the Daytona Museum and be a legit entrant, or that could go to Detroit to the CEO of whatever GM or one of their suppliers who's like a GM super fan and was into it, or it could go back to Pratt & Miller. We hear stories about where these things go sometimes. I always am a total optimist. I'm like, that car's going to get on track. We'll see that car on track somewhere. And it may or it may not. But it's always fascinating to think about who's looking for those cars. And I'm always thinking of the like very compact team, the single car trailer, and like you and me, Howard, like they're like kind of shoestringing it together, trying to get this thing, ready to go for the run group. But obviously there's a lot of people that run racing as seriously as they run other operations in their life, and it's a serious deal for some folks, even in the vintage realms.
No, your dream is the Bev Spencer towing his GTO with his whatever that is, his 65 Caddy.
Yeah, no, it was a Riviera. He was Buick.
There it
he
is.
was Buick, so that was a Riv. We've got a picture in the BAT office of a Buick Riviera, the Buick Ferrari dealer here in San Francisco, towing a 250 GTO on the back of it. And I mean, yeah, my dream is a little more outdated, perhaps, single axle trailer with a lightweight race car on it, or a 550 Spider Porsche being towed behind some sort of wagon or van, some sort of modest vehicle. Obviously you cruise into vintage race paddocks these days and there's $1 million transporters like supporting some of this high-end stuff. And it's awesome, and it's wonderful to see, and I love that people invest in it the way that they do. But yeah, I look at it through such a nostalgic lens that you're right. I love just sort of eking your way in, and those old stories of people that were kind of borrow the family car to take the race car to the track, sort of stuff is also cool to see. And you still see that, and I actually laugh my head off when I see that. Right, you'll roll to a vintage race event, and there'll be people there with open trailers, right? And they're like Craftsman toolbox in the back of their, F-150, and they're just putting it together, right? And I respect that in huge ways, and actually love seeing what those cars can do. Talk to me about, is it about winning?
Well, I was going to say, yeah, that's a good topic. What you said is so true. The vintage event paddocks now are littered with huge big rigs, and it makes sense, right? It as time marches on, it requires more people and resources to keep these things going. But I always think back to vintage racing kind of was born kind of in the mid '70s, and when you think back, like the cars that were running in those races, like they were 15 or 20 years old, like the great 50s race cars that were kind of retired or hung out to dry, and a small group of guys had an interest, and they started, at least in California, running vintage races in 1974, 75.
Fangio came to Monterey. He was like there.
That was 91. I remember that. That was 91.
Is that right?
Well, I was like 3 years old. Oh. I do remember the Fangio year.
You remember it. I love it. I was not there for that one. I would have been a little kid, and I missed that one. But yeah, I mean, that's what vintage racing. I don't think there was really anybody there. It was pretty low key, but like a huge star like that came and was.
Totally. Yeah, we were talking. I always think of a car that ran in vintage racing at the 1976 Monterey Historics. Like that's like its own version of like period race history now. Like it's crazy. And I always love the 50s and 60s stuff. Like the grids from up until probably the early 2000s, like the 50s grids were, 250 TRs and 300S Maseratis and Jag D types, and like talk about the spectacle of vintage racing, like, and you appreciate it more now that it isn't really around anymore, but you don't get those grids anymore, and those will never come back. But dropping the green flag on 30 of all like the best thoroughbreds from mid-late 50s, like that's so incredible. Mm-hmm. You still get that a little bit in Europe at places like Goodwood and elsewhere, but yeah, man. So yeah, we have great events in NorCal. So when I've done car events, I will often we don't have as we covered in a previous podcast, I don't have much ability to wrench, so I would like drive the car to the track, the CD8 or a 52 Chrysler Saratoga, and whatever, bring a box of tools as if I'm going to use them, like some rags, maybe some zip ties, whatever. Got to zip that a transponder on or whatever. And I remember last time I did it a couple of years ago, like I just parked in the pit stall, just the car in my like box, and like a couple of guys came up to me like, "Hey, like, are you okay?" Like do you need help?
You're like, do I look like I need help? Like, am I coming apart here? Why'd they ask that?
But
What
like,
were
I
they
was like
looking
totally like stuck out like a sore thumb, right? Like my 10 by 15 pit space had one car in it and like 2 folding chairs, and that's how it was like in the early days. But yeah, not so much anymore. So I guess I told him I'm okay if something breaks. I'm not gonna. There's no one here to fix it anyways. So I'm just here to have a good time. But
I love it. That's a good story. Anyway, you get all types. You get all types in these sort of paddocks. You get all types of cars. You get all types of people. You get all types of approaches. Back to about winning, though. I think it's super interesting, right? Because I think there's some of that East Coast, West Coast difference in approach. I was stoked when I went to Goodwood and guys are like, banging, GTOs into Zagato Astons, like it's not that big a deal. And here, I've heard, you're in the drivers' meetings. I've never been in any of these drivers' meetings. There's not a lot of contact. It seems a little bit mellower. In the high dollar stuff, sometimes it seems like they're kind of laying off, which is appropriate. But yeah, what's the sense of it? Are there egos and are there trophies and are there legacy behind this stuff, or are these guys going out to just keep the tires round on these things so they don't totally atrophy?
Definitely depends on the group. I think some groups are definitely more of the kind of racing exhibition mentality, right? The guys in their XK120s and Healey's and TDs, they're not so bent out of shape about winning the race. But yeah, like the B Sedan group, for example, definitely very competitive. People are definitely running over to look at their lap times, see where they qualified. Oh, we're doing an inverted grid. Oh no, come on, race store. We don't want that. And then the big boys, the F1 guys. And let's be honest. If you're driving a vintage F1 car well, like you have some chops, and that's pretty cool.
Yep.
It depends on the group. But yeah, there's definitely still people that are out there to get after it, and they want that bowling trophy.
Yeah. We have some West Coast bias, you and I. But yeah, I've heard different sorts of things about the rules and. The rules are a little bit more steered towards modification or, veering away from sort of historical correctness on the East Coast. So those guys, that breeds like a different type of racing because the brakes are all upgraded and the displacement.
The roller rocker debate.
Yeah, I imagine, right? Everybody's got a 289 Ford, but, some guys have 150 more horsepower than the other guys. Obviously, that creates a different sort of environment. So I always think that's sort of weird and interesting. But the guys in the know, a lot of them are super willing to talk about their cars. They're willing to talk about their experience. Some of these are like race car types, like bravado types that are a little tough to pull up a chair with. But there's a bunch of them that I've found, and honestly, BAT kind of gave me this inroad because I wasn't just some random dude wandering the pits like I was for a couple decades. I could at least name drop BAT and they'd be like, "Oh, okay, you're not a totally terrible, ignorant who knows what. Maybe one or two things, or could help me turn this torque wrench." So I got invited into a couple pits where guys are talking, what the 356 Porsche group is like, and who's way out in front and why, and a little bit of like gossip, right? There's all the like paddock gossip about who's doing this or who brought the new motor or the ace. This guy put a driver in his car this year, and now that guy's way out front, or different sorts of stuff.
Swapped his tires after practice.
Yeah,
put the Hoosiers on for the race.
Well, see, you know all the stuff, right? And so.
People refer to second as outside pole. You know they're competitive.
Yeah, seeing some of that sort of stuff, which as a spectator, which is me, like sitting, no joke, like in the bleachers watching this stuff, you have a ton of distance. You don't really see who's inside the helmet. I just judge everybody by if they hopefully don't make some huge mistake. If they look pretty clean going through stuff, they're pretty fast, their car's beautiful, I'm like, that must be a great person to have around. I love it, right? But then you get into the paddock and you hear all the backstories, and you hear the guy who went wide in turn 4 last year, so now he's like being hounded by all these other guys, or he blew out somebody's tail light last time, so now everybody's out to get it. There's so many narratives going on that you have no idea when you're like me and just sitting kind of watching stuff. But yeah, I had a couple glimpses into that, and in the drivers meeting and with you and your circles in the paddock, and experiences there, I'm sure you hear all these layers of this stuff, right?
There's definitely long-standing, deep-seated, kind of familial ties in these groups. My favorite is like the Trans Am group, which is a great group of probably 25 or 30 cars. It's a lot of the same guys that show up. They go all over the U.S.
But Trans Am can be, big Boss 302s and that sort of stuff, but it can also, to your earlier point, that can be an Alpha GTA or that can be a Datsun, right? So there's kind of a hierarchy within. When you say Trans Am, what are you talking about?
I feel like now more recently they've separated the big bore and small bore cars, and kind of the SCCA Trans Am 510s and Alphas and 2002s got their own group, but I think of like the Javelins and the Barracudas
Yes.
and Mustangs and all that stuff, and those guys they're sharp. They do some level of kind of theatrics and designing the race to be very visually pleasing for the spectators, but also at a certain point go out there and race each other. I love that. I would love to drive in that group.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I want to hold on. We'll definitely get to that in terms of what you want to be racing and what we may see you in before long. But something, those guys do. They always had sort of the Trans Am alley in the pits, right? And so all the cars are together. So you're walking down it, and it's like Javelin, Boss 302, Sunoco, Camaro, and they had like 2 of those Sunoco Camaros back in the day that were actually Donahue cars, and now there's like 11 of them racing in various states of who knows what, fighting over chassis numbers. And then, that whole scene. What was it? The Sam Posey Cuda, or the one that's like navy with orange on the side of it, number 40, 49, 48. Anyway, those cars, man. I love that group. I was always B sedan, B production. Shelby 65, 66 Shelby's was my favorite group. But you couldn't beat the Trans Am group. But I was shopping cars online like I'm always doing, and I tripped across a Mini the other day which said Trans Am history or whatever, right? And the small bore, the 4-cylinder cars that were battling in Trans Am, I guess they were on track at the same time, because I was looking at this funny little white Mini that I think Innes Ireland drove, if you're down with that name. And it's like Trans Am legit history, all this sort of stuff. And they showed a picture of it on some paddock at Marlboro or wherever, some old school track with no run out and really old school. And there's the front of the grid, these huge just monster Boss 302 cars and that sort of stuff. And then on the back of the grid, there's like a Cortina and a Mini. Like, I would just think they would just get demolished being on the same track as those big cars. But it was really more of a like modern sports car racing, where there's these huge variants in performance and horsepower, and they're on the same track, and it's kind of dangerous, but back then they were after it. So I've always thought that was interesting when people are talking Trans Am, which is why I grilled you. And it's like, is Trans Am in your mind these like Parnelli Jones type cars, or is it the smaller bore, equally competitive but smaller bore type stuff?
Totally. If you go look at the old race results, it's all very accessible. Go down to the bottom of the grid, and you'd be surprised at what cars you might find there. Right? Like, oh, I didn't know that they ran that. Like, we just had auction for a '78 IMSA Mazda 808. Like, I don't even know that existed. Right? There's all these.
What is that? Describe that.
It's kind of a B sedanish 1.6 liter 4-cylinder kind of shitbox thing.
Okay.
But
so that's like a streetcar-ish shell. I don't even know what an 808 is. I thought that could have been a Formula race car for all I know.
It looks like a Mercury Capri a little bit. Okay. Yeah, that style.
Interesting. Okay, and turn it into a race car, and that thing had legit history, huh?
But there's guys out there, right? If you're smart about it and you're a real true enthusiast, right? Go pick an era you love, find a car that everyone's forgotten about that was there, and that gets accepted, because you know what, that's historic and authentic, and it deserves to be there.
Yeah, and it's unusual, and people like seeing stuff that they never see dragged out. Not that another Boss 302 in full Trans Am spec is not wonderful to look at, but the esoteric stuff is really cool to see brought out. But circling back, what racing cars are firing you up? I know you've spent more recently some time in a couple Alphas. Your Datsun stuff we've covered pretty well. We covered the 31 Chrysler, which is the curveball.
We've covered
There's probably
ground.
maybe some other Alphas in there. What was in between the first day and the 31 Chrysler and more recent in Datsuns?
Yeah, I got the chance to drive a guy's Alpha GTA, which was definitely a dream come true for me, being a big Alpha guy. Stuff I'd love to drive. I have taken an interest in kind of 1990s to 2000 era NASCARs. There's so many of them. They're all still around.
You see the 43 Petty-ish car that we just sold, and it was
That's right.
25 grand.
And that was an earlier car though. That
Yeah,
was
a little bit, but
maybe early
it
late
was,
80s.
and Petty never drove it, but it was Petty Enterprises or whatever, and it was some driver that sounded legit from the early 2000s or late
Totally.
90s or something. And 25 G's and a legit, numbered NASCAR Cup car. I mean, yeah, I think I would love to see that group blow up, and maybe some of our listeners know. I mean, if you're living in Atlanta or whatever, I mean, maybe those groups are the massive groups down there running vintage NASCAR stuff. I don't see that as much out here. I mean, I've seen a few sort of special groups that have been put together, but it's not the norm. Have you seen those on track out here?
No, the closest we get, there's like the drum brake NASCAR group, which is wonderful.
Yep.
But no, a full grid of the later cars, like they're super safe. Like the brake pads are 6 inches thick. Like it's not. I guess my point is they're not like that hard to maintain if you're versus talking about C7R Pratt and Miller Vex.
Yeah,
like they're
night
pretty
and day.
straightforward. Like you can, someone halfway savvy around cars can like wrench on them and. So that's kind of on my radar. Maybe I can take up the mantle on that for NorCal.
I love that you're watching those. I mean, I would love to know if you had one of those. I mean, obviously you can just go work on your, Ricky Bobby by yourself. Or is there a place that you could go run those, right? I mean, is there a place you could get 8 or 9 of those together and actually go run them? Every time I've seen them, it's been at like a track day, and it's like, I mean, it raises all the eyebrows. Everybody's like, wow, like that guy just, you fire it up in the transporter and back it out, and everybody circles around because it's got a, 600 horsepower, Roush small block in it. And it's amazing. Open pipes out the side, which gets everybody's attention. But the question is, I mean, it's really awesome if you could get a bunch of them on track. And I haven't seen that, but I have to think, with the popularity of NASCAR and the more regional popularity of it, that, off weekends at Talladega or whatever, there's got to be people running those cars, or even Road Atlanta, or a bunch of different tracks. You must be able to get 20 of those together 3 times a year, right? Or maybe 40 of them together, that many times a year. I don't know. I'd love to look into that and figure out where you could actually do that. I would love to just go spectate that, because spectating at modern NASCAR is cool and interesting, but the cars, the iconic cars from 10, 20, 30 years ago are not super vintage looking, but that was just the time, right? When the car, there were more manufacturers involved. They were less aerodynamic. They were a little brickish.
You're talking like the Jeff Gordon car we sold, or earlier than that.
Yeah, that sort of thing, all the way, Bill Elliott Thunderbirds, right? Like, I mean, all that stuff. 80s, 90s, into
Bill
2000s.
Elliott, McDonald's, Bill Elliott.
Yeah. Or Bud King of Beers, right? Or no, Coors. He had Coors
That's
on the
right,
side
that's
of
right.
the he may have switched back and forth between those brands, but definitely had the golden arches on the hood for a little while. Anyway, so all of those cars are just so cool. And to your point, I mean, we're talking about, what did that C7R sell for? Like 800 grand, something crazy. NASCARs you're getting into for between 20 and 50K, call it. It just seems like that could be such a lively race group. So anyway, I'm going to dig that up a little bit. I'm going to research that, figure out where people are running those. I definitely think you ought to get into one of those. For me, if I, obviously worked on some skills and got some licensing sorted out, spent some more time on track, I've always loved the, Speedster versus Giulietta, sort of 1600cc, 2-liter and lower, late 50s cars. There's a lot of weird variety in that group, and you can run some really cool stuff. I've always loved the 3.0 CS. It's one of my favorite cars of all time, but those got pretty hairy by the time those got on track, right? 3.5 Honstuck CSLs.
That's a serious group.
Winged cars and stuff. Yeah, I don't think I could really hang with that group. I think that, that starts to be super high speed and super high stakes. What I like about some of those earlier cars, yeah, you mentioned drum brakes and different sorts of stuff. Even C1 Vet, I could get into C1 Vet, right? They didn't get too fast. C2 Vets I could maybe get with, but yeah, once you get to C3 and like Spirit of America, like huge wings and, what are they called?
Greenwood Vets.
Yeah, Greenwood Vets and stuff. I mean, once you start to eclipse, like 180 at Le Mans or whatever, I mean, it gets out of control.
Even like the CSLs, like they're at the back of the pack typically. Like it's like they got nothing for like the RSRs and the stuff that typically runs in the front. But there's CSL race prepared is no slouch.
Yeah, guys running 934s, 935s, that sort of stuff. That's way beyond my capability level and budget level. But I love race prep, and I love actually on the earlier cars. I really like the similarity to the street cars, right? On the modern
100%.
stuff, and even the NASCAR stuff. Obviously, you've totally diverged from anything production line. Oriented, but the old cars, I mean, the 356s that are out there, yeah, they have a crazy cam in them and they won't idle on the street and that sort of stuff. But it's pretty. I mean, different brake pad linings, but I mean, it's pretty much looks a lot like a car that you would see on the road with the hubcaps pulled off and a roll bar in it, right? And you talked about Jags earlier. You were kind of tongue in cheek about whether it's whatever Triumphs or Jags or that whole crowd. Those guys, there's a famous one you probably know in CSRG or wherever, the guy with the white XK120 that was like famous for driving it 2 hours to the track, racing, driving it, parking it outside at the hotel.
From Reno, no, he still comes out.
He's a Reno guy. Okay, anyway, that dude was always just sort of a legend. And he was, I don't know, mid-pack, back a pack or whatever, but he's just absolute legend status because it is a street car. That's another thing. Running cars on track that have plates on them with current stickers on them. Like, I just love that.
Less and less of that, but yeah, totally.
I loved it. I thought that was just so cool because you're like, oh yeah, we're just going to drive this thing to dinner tonight. Maybe we'll strap a glass pack muffler on it, or maybe we won't. Maybe we'll put earplugs in and go to Tarpey's for dinner down the street from the track. So anyway, that sort of stuff I've always liked and has seemed really accessible and interesting. And it's almost just like you're a performance driver, but you want to keep it quasi-safe by doing it on the track instead of driving your XK120 at 85 miles an hour up a 2-lane country road where you may cause some problems. You actually do take it to the track and do that sort of stuff. Yeah, to your point, I think that maybe is getting less and less, but that was my favorite stuff as a kid.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I love you'd be down. We could put you in like a Galaxy lightweight. That's very much over home plate for you. But yeah, no, I agree. I love that era. Part of it is like, how fast do you want to go, right? It's like, I think a lot of this stuff is cool. What do I want to race? Like, do I need to go 180 miles an hour in an F1 car? Like, no, I really don't. Yeah. Like, you want close racing, and guys that want to do that, like, good for them. Like the McLaren Can-Am car I referenced. But yeah, I mean, I think you can get 90% of the thrill and avoid 90% of the death machine angle. So I'm with you on that.
Yeah. So the race car category on BAT, we see a bunch of cars there. Like, where does this stuff come from? You mainly see people aren't flipping these cars, right? Because to your point, the audience is pretty narrow on most of them. But I mean, are we seeing people that have had these cars for 50 years and they're kind of hanging up their helmet? It's like kind of over and they're going to, retire or move on to something else, or are there younger folks that they've lost their interest? Like they're gonna go race speedboats now, or they're gonna like go do something else crazy because they're like daredevils and this was just a season. Or I'm always wondering like who are these people and where are they coming from and why are they selling this, or did they find it at some estate sale like this thing is some old dusty race car that needs to be recommissioned? What are you seeing on cars coming across?
Yeah, I think it's all of that. It's some people that are retiring and hanging it up. It's some people that, raced their Sprite and now they're going to step up to, a Group 6 Mustang, so that Sprite's going to go. or people that bought a car to do an event, and you did that event. Like the best example for me is like we've sold a couple really awesome like La Carrera Studebakers, which, speaking of NASCARs, is basically just a NASCAR with a Studebaker commando body on it. But yeah, man, that's like BAT is an awesome place to sell that, right? If you want to do that event, you're kind of like, well, I want to go to Mexico, I want to race. Like it's pretty daunting to like, if you want to do it, like how are you actually going to get to the starting line? Like it's not just like buy a ticket the week before and arrive and drive. So some of these guys have sold these, crazy La Carrera prepared Studebakers, and if you want to do that event, that car pops up. It's like kind of plug and play. Like that's the dream right there. That guy ran the event last year. The car finished, and I don't know from experience, but I can guarantee you, I think if I drove a Studebaker on La Carrera and I finished, I probably wouldn't need to do it again. I'd probably be ready to move it on to the next guy who wants that experience. So yeah, definitely that's in play.
Yeah, why are we limiting ourselves to racetracks, right? I mean, there's some of those sort of events that are totally crazy. And yeah, I was really hot to feature as many La Carrera cars as I possibly could, right? I mean, they had like a pretty hokey website message board, like cars for sale section that I used to troll. This is like 07, 8, 9, featuring that stuff on BAT. And then, yeah, La Carrera cars started to pop up here every once in a while. And I got to go visit the event and track the event as a sort of support helper with a buddy of mine. And man, what an event that was. And weird cars, Studebakers super popular, Volvos were super popular, a few Porsches, a few Alphas, international clientele, really interesting stuff. I always really liked those cars and their prep because they were a little visually chaotic because they like make you put 800 stickers on it.
Definitely chaotic,
right? Yeah,
yes.
But so they never looked like super beautiful usually, but they were built like with robustness in mind, right? Like they bottom these things out over like speed bumps on these roads and terrible roads and all that stuff. Obviously, there's all the historical lore of that event, but I mean, we've featured everything from Datsuns that ran that event to some Mercedes Fintails that ran that event, and just really wild, cool, different stuff.
That's a wild event, man. Talk about people that want to win.
Yeah, I mean that place does have some egos and some legacy and some nationalism, and scrutineering there is totally crazy. We could do a whole show on just the Carrera. We should do a show on the Carrera while
we could bring on some guests, people we know that have done it. Yeah. Like that's like for me, that might be too intense for me. Like, do you need to enter that corner so fast that you might go off the cliff? Like, do you need to finish the day? I mean, a couple seconds ahead.
Yeah, after we followed the event, like people are like, "What'd you learn? You want to go do it?" And I was like, "No, I do not want to go do it. I would love to like go watch it again, though, with all the towns and the miles they cover and the topography and the people and the food. I mean, all the stuff. It's just like a crazy, wonderful experience for the senses. But it's I'm already talking about how like I wouldn't drive anything without drum brakes on a U.S. track that's like perfect blacktop, and these guys are like launching cars off cliffs and stuff, doing things that are definitely suspect if you want to come home in one piece. But more power to them. I mean, cool cars, cool things going on. I'm trying to think of other events like that. I mean, this will be a topic for another show too, but racing, I mean, I started thinking about like off-road and Baja racing and trucks and all that sort of stuff.
Trans-Siberian.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Long distance rally. I mean, there's so many cool, interesting things. I don't know if we've listed a legit like Dakar entry type car on BAT before. Obviously there's a lot of safari tributes and different sorts of things that people are building these days and running off-road. But I don't know if we've listed an actual either Paris-Dakar or modern version of the Dakar Rally entrant or finisher in BAT auctions. I'd have to go look that up.
My favorite event from that era is Marathon de la Route. What's cool about that is I think it was 84 hours, but what people forget is two drivers and the rules said that you could not have any mechanical support. So the drivers could fix their car, but if you broke, you were done. The drivers could work on their car, but that was it. It was the true test of endurance and reliability and durability. So,
what's the geography for that? Where was that? Across Europe, or was that somewhere remote?
I think it was mostly in France, but all over.
Got it.
No, yeah. Check out Marathon de la Route. guys. It's
There's some
pretty
good
awesome.
videos and photo galleries from that.
914, 6 GTs.
There you go.
Doing that event. Then I think it turned into something else. But the early days, golden era of that is so awesome.
A lot of cigarette smoking, a lot of like shirtless mechanics, right? Like all that crazy stuff. I love all
Dude,
of
when
that.
I went to Nürburgring like 10 years ago, we did, you can go on Sundays and get the jar pass and whatever, €100, you can go rip around for 10 laps, which is like, 150 miles. But I like walked onto the pit lane and like pit lane at Nürburgring, like just like by the K wall, it's just like SIGs. Like it's
on the ground, you mean?
Yeah,
or people in hand?
No,
or you mean on the
both,
ground?
On the ground. Like
Yeah.
it was just such a great little like brief anecdotal moment for me. Like you would never see this, like especially in California, going to a racetrack. But I was like, well, there's like literally 1,000 cigarette butts here from all the races that would have been happening. So yeah, that was pretty awesome. I don't know why I just thought of that.
I love that. No, that's the flavor over there for sure. But yeah, in those old events, I mean, all the cars were sponsored by tobacco, and then it was just all over the place in all those photos. But a bygone era. But there's still some crazy stuff and retro events that are doing that, and people building race cars and rally cars and Carrera cars and track cars. But yeah, just to bring it back around and to some more sort of close by events. Are there any racing events that you'd love to hit in the next couple years, or that are kind of bucket lists that if you could drive that track, or if you could drive that car or drive that event, that they're on your list?
One I'd love to do, which I went as a spectator, is the Summer July Vintage event at Road America. The event's cool, but that takes place in Elkhart Lake, which is a super awesome Wisco Midwest town, and it has a population of 700 people. But for that event, 20,000 people show up, and it's all around the town, parked in the square. People are walking around, drinking their Spotted Cow. Shout out to people who know about Spotted Cow.
And you were there as a spectator, but have never raced it and want to
Correct.
go back. Is
Yeah,
that right?
yeah.
That's
So
right. That was a couple years ago, wasn't it?
Actually, I don't know if it's pretty awesome as a spectator. The racing is good too. That track is awesome. But that's on my list.
Yeah, no, that'd be a good one. I did not get to go. BAT did an event at that track. I have not been to that track. That's still one where I've never been, where I would like to go.
Like for example, what's the famous bar? Siebkens, which is the famous bar there in downtown Elkhart. And like I was walking around at like 10 or 11 p.m. and like Brian Redmond walks out of Siebkens, and like I chatted with him for like 10 minutes.
Amazing.
So that's pretty awesome, right?
Oh yeah, it's unbelievable. Kind of old timey, some of those small towns where the tracks were sort of remote, and maybe are lucky to have stayed a little bit remote now, and they still have some sort of flavor like that, as opposed to Riverside or wherever else, right, where it got bowled over by condo developments or housing developments and didn't survive past the 80s.
Well, Elkhart's also cool because before the track was built, there was a road course on the public roads that went through the town, and that town really embraces the motorsports heritage in a really cool way, and every corner has like a landmark mile marker. So everyone there is super plugged into the car world. I think I was 57, so not unlike Pebble Beach Road Races, and then they finally built Laguna in 57. Very similar thing happened in Wisconsin, but anyways, we could do a whole podcast.
Let's go there. Let's
dorky
go
50s
do the
racetrack
podcast
history.
there. You know what I mean? I want to hang out in that bar and do it there and hang out and see some of that racing. I'd love to visit that, and tracing the steps of the old road course sounds super awesome. So anyhow, those are a bunch of ways to come at race cars. Howard and I will see one car come across BAT, and it can spur a hour-long conversation like this about all sorts of aspects of that car and where our mind goes and different experiences that we've had. We'd love to hear your guys' experience and what questions you may have for us or other guests. We're excited for the upcoming sort of roll of guests we're going to get going too. So podcast at bringatrailer.com. You can always hit us with questions there. Or when we post these, obviously there sometimes becomes a lively comment discussion right there where we're posting the podcast. And then, hit us up with any other suggestions. And thanks so much for listening today.